is very remarkably situated. It stands close to the sea and is in great part built upon craggy and steep rocks, some of which rise perpendicular from the water. So wrote John Wesley, the famous Methodist preacher, on his first visit to Robin Hood's Bay on Tuesday the 8th of May 1753. If he could return today, he would recognise a village little changed in appearance, but Robin Hood's Bay was then a very remote and isolated community, and fishing is hard and dangerous work. It is not surprising that most of its inhabitants were quick to exploit its ideal position for the smuggling of contraband. At this time, the constant threat of invasion by the French meant that a strong army and navy had to be maintained, and to pay for these, the government imposed heavy duties on a range of goods at the time. Smuggling was, of course, illegal, cheating and dishonest. And despite the heavy penalties for smuggling, the rewards far outweighed the risks involved. And so this lucrative occupation thrived here for some 80 years, from about 1740 until 1820. Standing on the shore at dead of night, it's easy to imagine what it must have been like, waiting for the smuggling ships to come in close to shore. There would be a sudden burst of activity as the contraband was brought ashore and whisked away to be secreted in the cottages. The tunnel leading under the village from the slipway was ideal for hiding the goods. Many houses were built over it and had secret passages and trapdoors in their cellars leading into it. Secret cupboards with doors into the adjoining houses enabled goods to travel undetected from the bottom of the village to the top. You may ask yourself, how could a whole community become involved? Surely some people must have been against it. Often they were forced into it by sheer desperation. Imagine trying to feed and clothe a large family simply through fishing. You were entirely dependent on the weather, and in a hard winter, weeks could go by with storms raging up against the cliffs. There would come a time when, on the verge of starvation, the only way to get money would be to join a smuggling gang. But once you had done that, there was no going back, because you would then be in possession of dangerous and secret information. Many would have had a conscience about getting involved in illegal activities. John Wesley came here many times and had a strong following. He recorded in his journal that he preached from a window in the square. Did he realise that almost right next door was the Mariners' Tavern, a notorious haunt of the local smuggling fraternity? He does not record having spoken out publicly against smuggling here in Robin Hood's Bay, although he did so elsewhere, even though he must have realised that many of his faithful followers were deeply involved. For instance, there is the case of William and Mary Cobb. In 1772, William's house was searched by the revenue officer Horatio Roberts, and a large amount of contraband tea was discovered, which he had not had time to hide. He was one of the village grocers, so his customers would have a regular supply of this luxury beverage, which we take so much for granted today. Worse still, his wife Mary was found to be hiding kegs of gin under her bed. Very naughty for a God-fearing Methodist lady. 26 years later, a document dated the 18th of August 1798 shows William's name on the list of trustees for the new Wesleyan Chapel on Low Street, now renamed Chapel Street. And still later, when the chapel needed to expand, Mary donated her garden and pig cote as building land. How long William and Mary had been involved in smuggling, we do not know, but they could have been extremely rich, as 1 pound of tea cost less than 3 pence in Holland and sold legally in Britain for £1.20. The smuggling run, as it was called, involved a huge number of people. It was reckoned that almost half the population of the British Isles were affected in one way or another by smuggling, the network spreading to towns and cities far inland. The contraband being moved on dark, moonless nights included spirits, mainly brandy or Geneva, today known as gin, fine wines, tea, tobacco, perfumes, snuff, jewellery, and fine fabrics such as silk and lace. The local fishermen would all be heavily involved. Their lifetime's knowledge of the dangerous coastline, tides and currents made them vital for the safe landing of illicit goods. They, however, needed a leader, someone with connections, influence, and the ability to organise the distribution of the goods. We know of 2 such important men in this area. Squire Farside lived in great style at Thorpe Hall, a mile or so inland. In his garden, close to the stream running nearby, he had a very handy drop-off point, a stone-lined chamber just big enough for a couple of brandy kegs. On Ravenscar's 600 feet high cliffs, south of the village, stands Raven Hall, now an hotel, but then the home of Dr. Willis. He was a wealthy man, having been physician to King George III, who reputedly stayed here during periods of his madness. In the grounds of the house, facing the sea, is a chamber cut into solid rock, with a shelf inside to hold a signalling lantern. If you were caught signalling to smugglers, there was a £500 fine, a huge sum of money. The gentleman in charge would go to Holland or France and purchase large quantities of goods and arrange for them to be shipped over. The goods would be ferried ashore under the cover of darkness and then hidden as quickly as possible. Some time later, when transport had been arranged using horses and carts supplied by the local farmers, the goods would be moved inland for distribution, taken on the various lonely tracks over the moors. There was always a large and healthy demand for cheap, tax-free luxuries. Now, if you think it was only men who were smugglers, then you'd be wrong. Whilst the men would do the really heavy work, the women would seek out and create hiding places to conceal the goods. They would also be involved with the distribution. Whilst most of the goods were moved in bulk, some were retained for the smugglers' personal use and their own quick profit. When the woman went to market with crabs and lobsters or travelled the fish road to Saltersgate, they would also carry with them quantities of illicit goods for sale. Of course, they had to be extremely careful and would often have secret pockets inside their clothing, or wear a smuggler's belt under their skirts. French fashions were much admired, but there was an import ban on all French fabrics and laces to help the British trade for the silk weavers of Spitalfields and the lace makers of Honiton and Nottingham. The wife of one of the local gentry needed a new dress for a very smart party, and the only way to obtain the coveted garment was to have one smuggled in. It was a bit squashed when it arrived, as it had been tightly rolled up and hidden in an innocent-looking spice chest. In one of the Bay's most famous smuggling incidents, it was a very elderly lady called Rebecca who saved the day. In October 1779, things had gone badly wrong for the smugglers. Over 200 kegs of spirits, 150 bags of tea, and large quantities of other contraband had been landed on the beach. Someone had given a tip-off to the local preventives, who appeared quickly on the scene to intercept the goods. The smugglers had to work fast. Much of the contraband rapidly found its way into the tunnel and up into the cellar of the Fisherman's Arms, but there wasn't room for it all. Other barrels and boxes went swiftly into nearby cottages. Old Rebecca was sitting quietly by the fire knitting, when in burst a smuggler who dumped a keg of brandy on the floor with the instructions, "Get rid of that, quick," and ran off up the alley. Rebecca knew that she did not have the time or strength to get the keg into the cellar, so she rolled it to the fireside and, spreading her skirt around it, sat tight. Shortly after, the door burst open again, and this time it was Peter Maxwell, the keenest and most feared of the preventives. He raised his lantern and examined the room for any sign of the goods. Rebecca, of course, denied any knowledge. How could she, a frail old lady, possibly have anything to do with all this fuss? He could search as he would, but her backache was so bad that she couldn't get up to help him. Eventually, he left, and she was at last able to get up from her uncomfortable seat. She had been lucky, for Peter Maxwell was no fool. Devising methods of misleading the preventives was important. Rumours would be loudly spread that a landing was due under the cliffs at Ravenscar, and the smugglers would chuckle as the preventives moved off along the shore, laden with ropes and lanterns. The real landing would take place on the beach near the slipway, and would be timed so that the rising tide would cut off the return of the preventives, so foiling their plans. The work of these preventive officers was a thankless task, with meagre wages, which meant that they often took bribes. They were in a strange and hostile environment, and were hated by almost everyone in the area. Robin Hood's Bay was considered to be one of the worst places to work. It was also regarded as one of the wealthiest places in England for its size, due to the huge amount of contraband which poured through its narrow streets. To increase the effectiveness of the preventives, a revenue boat with a sitter and 6 armed men was stationed here. This would have caused a bit of a panic at the time, but with so much at stake, the local smugglers, with their superior knowledge of the coastline and tides, soon learned how to evade capture. There was too much at stake financially to let them get in their way. Skippers of the large smuggling ships could earn as much as £250 for a night's run. The seamen and overland carriers up to £5, and the landers on the beach a guinea. When you consider that the basic working wage was 6 shillings a week, 30 pence in today's money, these amounts speak enough of the risks and huge profits to be made. It was essential that nothing or nobody got in the way on the night of a run, and the smugglers played on people's fears and superstitions. For example, if a farmer's horse was to be used, preferably a dark one, it would be rested during the day prior to the run. And to warn strangers away, he would place a witch stone over the stable door, indicating that the horse had been found sweating in the stable in the morning, and that it had been ridden by the local witch as a night mare. The horse would be well fed, and sacking boots would be fitted to muffle the sound as it left the stable. Some stretches of road at key points also had to be kept clear. A short length of road connected two pony tracks at Linger's Corner between the bay and Filingthorpe. The local farmer, in league with the smugglers, donned a white sheet and rode his white horse up and down, making horrible moaning noises until the smugglers were safely away. It was the worst possible bad luck to have an encounter with the Linger's ghost. And even today, on a dark, moonless night, it has an eerie feel about it. Over the years, many people have reported seeing a tall, dark-cloaked figure standing gazing out to sea at the top of King Street. This is reputed to be the ghost of the notorious bay smuggler, Captain David Pinkney. He was a major thorn in the side of the local constabulary and had always managed to evade capture. On the 6th of January 1795, a warrant was issued for his arrest, and the constabulary were informed that Pinkney was now at home in Robin Hood's town and may be apprehended if proper authority received. But Pinkney himself had also received warning of the constable's visit and barricaded himself into his house, meeting the demand that he come out and be arrested in the name of the king with a barrage from his shotgun and a torrent of abuse. The constable retreated, and the warrant was not executed, and to save embarrassment, it was reported that Pinkney had already gone back to sea. Smuggling goods was two-way traffic. It made economic sense for a ship to return to the continent with another profitable cargo on board. This was, perhaps oddly, you might think, sheep's wool. Our Yorkshire monasteries made fortunes from farming sheep. There was a significant woolen industry on the continent, and as our moorland sheep produced very fine quality fleece, demand was great. It was heavily taxed, thus making it the ideal cargo for illegal export. So much was disappearing from our coasts that a law was passed that any farmer keeping sheep close to the shore had to keep accurate records of the movement of stock and the sale of fleeces. These records were regularly checked by the revenue men. If they didn't tally, the farmer could lose his farm, be imprisoned, and made a public example of by having his right hand chopped off as a warning to others. One local farmer living near Stoopbeg had mistaken the date for the arrival of the smugglers to take his wool, and was disturbed at his supper on the appointed night by the sea captain, who had delivered his cargo of silk, lace, tobacco and brandy, and now he wanted the expected fleeces for the return journey. As the sheep had not been shorn, the only way of getting the wool away that night was to take the sheep as well. With no more ado, the sheep were driven down to the shore and ferried to the ship standing offshore. This left the farmer with the problem of explaining the loss of his flock to the revenue men in 2 weeks' time. There's no record of the farmer being caught and punished, so he must have borrowed a neighbour's flock on the day of the inspection. Even if he had been caught, it was almost impossible to get a conviction, as many magistrates were either actively in league with the smugglers or taking bribes. One local magistrate was riding home with a couple of kegs of brandy slung over his saddle when he saw approaching him 2 of the preventive officers. They would certainly have recognised him, so he swiftly dismounted and hid in a gorse bush, whilst his horse continued riderless along the track towards them. They would have been delighted with the capture of the horse and brandy, as they would get a nice reward for the spirits and a good profit from the sale of the horse. The magistrate would make sure that at the next horse fair someone would bid for him, so at least he would get his horse back. All good things come to an end, and for the villagers of Robin Hood's Bay, who had never had it so good for several generations, the lucrative but dangerous era of smuggling was drawing to a close. The threat of invasion declined after Trafalgar in 1805, and with the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815, the need to raise huge amounts of money through duties diminished. At the same time, many sailors no longer needed to fight the French were incorporated into the new Water Guard, and with so many of these patrolling the coast, the chances of being caught was greatly increased. The professional smugglers could no longer earn a living, and by about 1820, large-scale smuggling had ceased, and those involved had to make a living by more honest means. Thus ended the era of smuggling at Robin Hood's Bay. But the excitement and romance lingers on. Go up to the high cliffs at Ravenscar and look down towards the sea. Is it your imagination? Or are those shady figures moving about down there?